Now, I want to put this discussion, and there's some stuff here that I've never really put together in this way, um, because I really believe, to the extent that both your intellect, and I'm talking partly to your intellect, but I'm also discussing here to your subconscious and your kind of communication between your deep self, inner self, your subconscious self, your higher self, whatever you want to call it, and your conscious mind. Because when you do your transcripts, it's the now consciousness that you're putting down on your piece of paper, and yet it's connected with something, as you know, much, much deeper. So I really want to get into this deep model. And it all begins with consciousness is fundamental. Um, Now, this blue circle, take it to represent the physical, spiritual universe. It contains everything. And I mean thing in the broadest sense that you can imagine. Anything that consciousness touches is the only words I can use. In space-time, plus the spiritual world, an idea. Consciousness clearly touches the idea of blue and red, right? That's in here. So this circle contains everything consciousness touches in the broadest sense that you can imagine. Now, what's so interesting about this, this whole construct, which actually makes it, I think, real, a valid construct, is that you need to ignore this boundary. I mean, I have to put it down as a circle, for example, but it's like a circle without a boundary, because any thought you had that might be outside, guess what? As soon as you had it, it's inside. There is no boundary to the universe of collective consciousness, which is what I call this blue. There can't be anything outside it, because even if you try to imagine it, construct something outside, it immediately is inside. So it's got no separation. It's the ultimate definition of oneness and harmony. Now, when we try to bring something out, as we do, I mean, I see myself as an individual. I'm sitting on one chair right now, and I can try to bring that out. The fact that there are no boundaries anywhere really means that this thing that you're bringing out does have a boundary. So they can't be separated from the circle. And this really means that there's like a fuzzy boundary around it. And I'm going to talk more about this. There really is some uncertainty in anything that you try to separate. I mean, think of you, you think maybe you have a really well-defined physical boundary, but do you? You've got radiation going out from you all the time, for example. You're moving through time. You're not exactly the same. Your molecules are, you've got a fuzzy boundary. What is really you? And that holds for everything, including a chair. You think of a chair as being really, really clear, but you know what? It isn't. The idea of a chair, of course, has lots of specific different forms. But if you take any one chair, it also has a fuzzy boundary, because it too is changing through time. It too has a temperature which is radiating out into the rest of the universe. So what is its, in fact, boundary? And if you try to measure the exact boundary, the actual physical uncertainty principle would tell you can't measure it exactly when you get down to a very small size. So there's uncertainties. There's even uncertainties in definition. Is that a chair? Um, wait, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Is that a chair? You know, is that a chair? Well, it's sort of chair-like, but it's not a chair. Uh, is that a chair? She's sitting. It's got some characteristics like a chair. So in some ways, maybe it's actually entangled to the word chair. Okay, you're beginning, I hope, to see what a fuzzy boundary, might mean, because it just connects everything with everything else. Now, you are in here, you've got a fuzzy boundary, but you also are the one that provides meaning to all these things. You're the one that provides the meaning to the word chair. So you're an important part of, obviously, this whole process. So this is you. Okay. Now, you and any event are in this UCC. But think about it. How many events are there? Essentially an infinite number. Infinite number, really, even in your life. But if we now begin to say that all of these events are here, consciousness touches all of them, okay? Past, present, and future events. Focus on your events. Those are like lots of them. But one of the things you can do, and I think you're quite thankful that you can do that, is you can ignore events, right? I mean, if you had to remember all the events in your life at once and have them present with you, you would certainly be overwhelmed. So it's terrific that you can ignore events. Now, that kind of decreases the entanglement with those events. They're not there with you at the conscious level. But the other thing which is amazing is that you can increase entanglement. There are some events in your life that are just stronger than others. And there's actually, in quantum mechanics, and I didn't show it this time, but there's a proof that in quantum mechanics, entanglement can be increased and decreased. Physical connections can be increased and decreased. Why not anything in this universe of collective consciousness? So now look, what does that mean? That means that an event, okay, which includes time, goes through time, like your remote viewing session, just as a pretty good example. Okay, so one event is your remote viewing session. Another event could be your feedback session. And you can indeed increase that entanglement. It's your consciousness creates a kind of handshake between these two events, and you can enhance this entanglement. And that's a very important thing to get, again, deep down. You can do this. And guess what? This is going to be able to help you get more hits, and I'd like to get into that now even in more detail. So this UCC, this Universal Collective Consciousness, is like Ingo Swann called it, a matrix. That all these ideas are really very much the same. The Akashic record, all that is. So everything is in the UCC. So you can think of the infinite number of dots in that circle as being a thing. So now the fuzzy boundary is a thing, right? That's an idea. I just talked about it in the context of entanglement, the UCC. But let's focus on the fuzzy boundary for a moment. The fuzzy boundary is the entangler, if you will, of anything to everything else. So you've got a fuzzy boundary. It's your fuzzy boundary that allows you to have access to everything else in the universe. Since there's really no separations, it's the fuzzy boundary. That's part of the definition of this fuzzy boundary as I'm using it here. It is the entangler with anything. But notice, okay, so your fuzzy boundary is entangled to every single one of these points. But notice the thickness of these lines. Remember we had that one line get thicker? The strength of the entanglement is the absolute key. If you go back and try to remember things, there's some things which come back really easily. You know, what'd you have for breakfast this morning? You know, where were you yesterday at noon? What's the most happy occasion you can remember? Things are entangled with different strengths, and how they come up into your consciousness is a function of that strength. It's a kind of entanglable energy. I've given other talks where I've used those words. And it's a consciousness kind of energy, an entanglement energy. And that makes sense. I mean, I'm not really saying anything I think that you would disagree with here. But this point of view opens you up to improving the entanglements with your hits, for example. Okay, which is obviously where we're headed. Now, the other thing, just to say out loud here is, you know, I'm talking about things being entangled, showing it this way, but all these points are entangled. Everything is entangled to everything else. A line as opposed to no line here means, okay, well, maybe it's a little bit stronger. So it's just another way of showing that. Now, look what we've got here. Your remote viewing session is a thing. It happens to go through time. It involves transcripts, your pencil, your paper, mostly your consciousness and writing it down, but your whole session is a thing. It has a fuzzy boundary. Well, guess what? Your feedback session is also a thing, right? So now look at some of the connections that I'm indicating here. Your remote viewing session, nicely connected directly to the feedback session, but it might be connected to, and notice you can create them, okay? You get to make these connections, more connections, okay? And what are some of these kind of connections that you're doing here? Okay, you're making these connections, and you can do that consciously. And of course, we're going to talk about how, but the more connections you make, doesn't it make sense it would be better? Okay, the dynamics of that. Well, examples of this are gestalts. The gestalt connecting up with your feedback session, intending that, working that, making that happen, you can add this entanglement energy to the gestalts. You can also do that with the elements, which are conscious perceptions. Sometimes I'll call them precepts. Rustar called them elements of the target, which you're getting matches with. These are what the remote viewing session, when you think about it from this perception, from this perspective, is really all about, is making the entanglements of the feedback session elements, gestalts, and getting all that information during your remote viewing session. So that really is the details of what I showed you earlier. In this one big arrow are all the little arrows we talked about, not little arrows, but lots of them here. This major entanglement during your remote viewing session really wants to entangle with the appropriate elements from the feedback session, the gestalts, everything. So it seems pretty clear with this model that to get more hits, you want to make as many feedback entanglements as possible. The more, the better. Doesn't that make sense? Always make that part of your intention and expectation, because you're going to be doing it during your feedback session. You're going to be strengthening these entanglements. I mean, it's like a handshake. It involves both. Now, again, here you are. Your intention, expectation, all of your attention is focused on this entanglement. When you focus on this entanglement, this is basically intending and expecting to get hits. And the fuzzy boundaries here are what connect all of this, including, of course, your conscious mind, your ego, and your subconscious mind. Now, we spend most of our time talking about the communication channel between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, which all have fuzzy boundaries, of course. But the ego here is important, and I want to say just a few words about that. The ego is a good thing. It's part of you. Do some people have egos which may very well be too big as society might judge it? Fine, okay, but that's separate from the fact that it's your day-to-day living, the manner of how you get through the physical day-to-day living, your life. You have your ego. And you just need to recognize that, because it comes into play here. Certain things that you like and don't like. All the time we see people say things about targets. Gee, I really didn't like that target. And watch your consciousness when you're saying that sort of thing. Now, how it affects your hits, you need to be really careful, because if it's coming from your ego, it's not coming from the communication channel you're trying to make here. The idea in general is to only use that part of your ego, which is enough to get this communications that we're talking about, the good ones that are associated with the feedback target, onto a sheet of paper. But guess what? That's not going to happen. And understanding 100% of the time, understanding that your ego is going to be making a contribution to your conscious moment during the remote viewing session, and learning to be aware of what's coming from the ego as opposed to the subconscious, and as opposed to these kind of connections, is part of the wonderful thing which you get to learn as you do ARV, and which will affect other parts of your life. Okay, so that's really the basic approach. I just want you to kind of get that the universe of collective consciousness and you So the red is you. Oh, those colors aren't quite right. Obviously, you can ignore that. But you're in the universe, but you know what? All of our definitions of the universe, notice I've got a fuzzy boundary, are within you. And Skip Atwater made what I thought was such a wonderful statement that I want to share with you. Some say that we pass from spirit into the physical at birth, and conversely pass from the physical world into spirit at death. I say that we never pass from spirit. And it's that statement that I think shows that all of these communications that we're doing with precognition is really done way down at this deep, non-physical, spiritual level. And that's pretty marvelous. That's pretty marvelous.